Welcome back, capital F football fans, to the O&O Sports YouTube channel. Today we're back at it with our third season preview. Now, if you're new around here, basically in our season previews, we're going to give a little recap on the team that we're previewing from the year prior, and then we'll give a brief overview, strengths, weaknesses, all that good stuff, and then we'll get into final grades and predictions. Now, if you do enjoy this video, be sure to like and subscribe. It helps us out a lot. And if you're interested in some of our previous season previews, there are two more that you can watch after this one. They will be linked at the end of the video. And as always, you voted on it. By the time you're seeing this video, a new poll for a new team will be up. And today it is the Florida Gators. So for the Florida Gators in 2023, what went wrong? Well, first, their schedule was just insanely difficult. They don't really have a lot of control over that because the schedules are made well in advance, but it was not good. They were 19th in strength of schedule last season, which was first amongst teams that did not make the postseason. So when teams make the postseason, their strength of schedule gets boosted. Florida did not make the postseason, and other than that, they were just flat out bad on the road. They had the benefit of playing only 5 road games in 2023, and they went 1 for 4 in those games with losses to Utah, Kentucky, LSU, and Missouri, and a win over South Carolina. Just not a good road team in 2023, and to top that bad season off, they were really bad down the stretch. After their bye week, they went 0-5, which included an overtime loss at home to Arkansas, which was Arkansas's only conference win in 2023. Now, other than the schedule, the defense was just pretty bad all around. They were 91st in opponent yards per game with 406.7 per game, 124th in opponent yards per play with 6.5. Abysmal numbers there. For the pass defense, they were 84th in pass yards per game, 241.3 pass yards per game, 124th in passing yards per attempt, 8.5. Teams almost averaged a first down per pass attempt on Florida last season. They were 59th in opponent completion percentage. Not terrible, but also not very good when paired with all of these other stats. Teams averaged about a 60.5% completion percentage on Florida, and they were 88th in sacks, almost 2 sacks per game, which is not that good. And for rush defense, they were 88th in rush yards allowed per game, with 165.5 and 117th in rush yards allowed per attempt with 5.1. The defense was easily the weakest unit. The offense wasn't bad last season, but we'll get more into that in a second. The turnover margin was another big dilemma for Florida. They were tied for 96th in the country with a negative 0.4 turnover margin, which isn't that bad. I mean, there are some good teams with a negative turnover margin, but when you're Florida, can't really stay on the field much during the season. You don't want to be negative in the turnover margin also. That just means your offense is not going to be on the field as much. And that is what directly led to some of those losses. Now, speaking of, the third down offense was another big area of concern for Florida in 2023. They just could not stay on the field. They were 100th in third down conversion percentage. They only converted on 34.7% of their third downs. Like I said, just could not stay on the field, and that played directly into their detriment last season. Going to be a big need for improvement if they want to be better in 2024. And last, the pass protection was not good at all. They were tied for 119th in opponent sacks allowed per game with 3.5. Now, Graham Mertz is a very good quarterback. We'll get more into that in a second, but when he's getting sacked 3.5 times per game, it's bound to throw a wrench in the offense's plans, and was part of why they just couldn't stay on the field, couldn't make points out of drives last year. That was what went wrong last year. What went right for the Florida Gators in 2023? Like I just said, Graham Mertz was the main one. I mean, he improved drastically from seasons past. His best season at Wisconsin was in 2022, when he had 2,100 pass yards, 19 touchdowns, 10 interceptions, and a 52.9% completion percentage. Now, those numbers don't jump off the page. They aren't great. I mean, they're pretty decent for a Wisconsin quarterback. Wisconsin isn't known for their quarterbacks, at least not yet. Luke Fickell might get that turned around. But in Florida last season, he threw for 2,900 yards, 20 touchdowns, only 3 interceptions with a 72.9 completion percentage, which ranked 3rd nationally. Mertz is a very qualified starter. He's one of the more underrated quarterbacks in the SEC. He could be amongst the elite if he just gets those touchdowns and pass yards up. And in order to do that, the blocking just needs to be better. We will get more into that. We just talked about that, but we will talk more about that in a second. But other than that, the defense was surprisingly solid on third down. Their third down conversion percentage allowed was only 37%. So theirs was 34%, but I mean, they held their opponents to a 37% third down conversion rate, which was 45th in the country. Pretty decent, especially when you take a look at the rest of that defense. You wouldn't expect a defense that is that mediocre all around to be stronger in an area like third down conversion rate. So that was very interesting to find out. And last, for what went right, their special teams punter Jeremy Crawshaw was exceptional last year. He was an all-SEC second-team player. Really did wonders for the field positioning game for Florida last season. And kicker Trey Smack, who I will add just has an elite name, was a very solid kicker. He converted on 81% of his field goals and 100% of his extra points. Now, 81% isn't amazing, but that's mainly due to the fact that he was shaky from beyond 40. He was very reliable. He went 100% on kicks under 40 yards. And he has a big leg. It's just an accuracy once you get 40 plus. His long was 54 last year. So it wasn't all bad for Florida last year. And if you watched the Florida game last year, you noticed that Graham Mertz and the offense were able to make stuff work at times. It just was not consistent enough to where it turned into a meaningful stretch of wins, especially late there last year. And that's 2023. But what about 2024? For Florida's schedule, they play Miami at home, Samford at home, Texas A&M at home, Mississippi State on the road, and then they have a bye week. UCF at home, Tennessee on the road, Kentucky at home, and then another bye week. Georgia at a neutral site, Texas on the road, LSU at home, Ole Miss at home, and Florida State on the road. Now, to put it bluntly, that could be the worst final stretch of games we've seen in a long time. And if you want to get down to it, I mean, there's really only one guaranteeable win on the schedule, and it is Samford, an FCS school. This schedule is just horrific for Florida. If Napier wants to go bowling and keep himself off the hot seat list, he might want to go undefeated in the first 5 games. That's going to be your best bet to go bowling. You have Miami at home, Samford home, Texas at home, Mississippi State on the road, bye week, and UCF at home. 4 of those first 5 are at home, so that might lend to their favor. But once you get past that second bye week, it is another gauntlet of a 5-game stretch, kind of like what they had last season, but honestly probably worse. Georgia, Texas, LSU, Ole Miss, Florida State could be 5 top 10 teams in 2024. And this is probably the worst schedule in the country. I think it is cemented as that by that final 5 stretch. Many other publications would probably agree with me. It is not going to be pretty for Florida unless they can get a lot of stuff together. And speaking of, what are Florida's strengths in 2024? Well, for one, the quarterback room is pretty solid. Mertz should easily be the quarterback 1, but if anything were to happen, God forbid, they have one of the most impressive incoming freshmen in DJ Lagway. He has a very good arm. He can run. He is a very capable player. I mean, he will be a true freshman, so ideally you don't want to have him coming in and burning that redshirt season. And if they end up not wanting to burn that redshirt, they have another very capable backup, Clay Millen, who is a high completion percentage guy. Not amazing, but he's going to be either the second or third string, so I mean, what more can you expect? He's a pretty solid backup, and with DJ Lagway in there, could be one of the best freshman quarterbacks in the sport. And they returned production in key areas. I mean, the O-line wasn't good in 2023, but they were also a pretty young unit. And they should take a step forward in 2024. They add talent to the interior and the outside. They add interior offensive lineman Jason Zandamela from USC and Brandon Crenshaw-Dixon from San Diego State to fill out that offensive line, give it some more depth, give it some more talent on the interior and exterior, which should hopefully be a point of maybe like an anchor for that unit. I mean, they're going to have another year of experience, so I don't necessarily think they need it, but they do lose a few offensive linemen to the portal. So adding guys who have quality starting experience like Zandamela and Crenshaw-Dixon is huge for them. And the D-line is more of the same story. It's a young-ish unit that sees a lot of players returning from last season, and they add depth and potential in Penn defensive lineman Joey Slagman. Slagman was the Ivy League Defensive Player of the Year in 2023, and we'll have to wait and see on how he adjusts to the Power 5, to the SEC level. he should be one of the better players for that defensive line in 2024. And other than that, the skill positions are still really good. They lose Trevor Etienne to the portal, but they return Montrell Johnson at running back. Etienne was a big loss, but I mean, Johnson was just as good. He was arguably as productive as Etienne last year. The running back room has solid returning experience, but does lack a bit in the depth department. Pretty solid unit, all things considered. And at wide receiver, they have Eugene Wilson III returning. He should be in store for another good year. He had around 500 yards receiving last year. And I would say he could take a giant step forward, but Florida added 2 potential 1,000-yard receivers in Elijah Badger from Arizona State and Kamiri Dike from Wisconsin. Dike was the best wide receiver on a Wisconsin team that couldn't figure out how to pass. I mean, in 2022, they ran the ball most of the time. 2023, Luke Fickell takes over. They try to get better at the pass. They try to have a more balanced offense, and he was their number 1 wide receiver, even though at times it felt like Wisconsin just couldn't pass the ball. And likewise, Elijah Badger was arguably the best player for Arizona State in general the past 2 seasons. So both of those guys come in, they could be easily in the 1,000-yard range, if not exceeding 1,000 yards, which when you already have an experienced guy in Eugene Wilson, lends very well to what the offense and Graham Mertz should be able to do in 2024. And that is going to elevate their upside, but that was the strengths. What about weaknesses for the Florida Gators in 2024? Well, for one, the linebackers aren't the greatest unit of all time. The unit lacks depth. They have a lot of young dudes who threaten to have a lot of experience this year, which, I mean, could be good, but obviously you want more experienced guys in the rotation. They have decent returning production, but not really enough to warrant considerable improvement. Shamar James and Derek Wingo should be the best 2 players in that unit. Both are pretty good, but the unit altogether lacks depth, and they lack that number 1 guy who has a lot of proven experience. And on top of that, the secondary is kind of iffy, much like the linebacker room. The unit itself does have some solid guys, but lacks the overall quality and depth to be considered like a very solid unit. And if I sound confused, it's because they've made some solid moves and improved depth, and they've added guys with a lot of upside like Cormani McClain. It's just really hard to get a gauge on how good the unit is going to be, because once again, it's just an overall pretty unproven unit. They're still relatively young, but they're going to have to play to their fullest potential in order to not be a weak unit, I would say. They weren't very good in 2023. And when you have to play in the SEC, I mean, you are going to want to have a very, very solid secondary just to kind of disrupt rhythms of a Carson Beck, of a Brady Cook. And I don't know, with the depth still being a bit of a concern, and with the unit not being spearheaded by that solidified like DB1, safety 1, a guy who can lock down a receiver, tight end, running back, whatever it may be, it's hard to get a full judgment of that unit. Like I said, it's going to have a lot of upside. They can be a good unit. It's just really hard to pinpoint it when they lack the depth of like a Georgia, obviously, an Ohio State, even a Tennessee or an Alabama. And last for their weaknesses, this might sound like a bit of a cop-out, but it's going to be the it factor. Now, you might be wondering what that means. Well, Florida really couldn't get it done when it mattered down the stretch. It felt like something was holding them back. They just could not get it done when it mattered the most. And for Florida, they are a pretty physically gifted team, so you have to imagine it might be a mental thing holding them back. Billy Napier and company are going to have to instill more confidence in them as an offensive and defensive unit, honestly. And you'll see that, like we talked about earlier, with the third down conversion rate, opponent third down conversion rate. Those things will improve not only with better players or a better scheme, but when you can rattle off a few third downs in a row, you can keep your offense on the field, the defense isn't tired. Those things will massively improve. And that isn't all of what I consider it factor, but when it feels like you're playing with low confidence, you can kind of see that by the physical effort being put out onto the field. Again, that's going to be a really hard thing to kind of hammer down and pinpoint from a coaching perspective. But if Napier wants to keep his job, he's going to need to do it in 2024. Going to need to be a more confident team if you want to win more than 5 games this season. And that was the overview. Now on to the 2024 final grades and predictions. But before that, let's get into some keys to success. The first thing is going to be blocking. They had two great running backs in 2023, but they were somehow a middle of the pack running offense. And that's going to come down to poor run blocking. When you have running backs who combine for over 1,400 yards, but you're a middle of the pack rushing team, it's hard to completely put that on the running backs. I mean, you can't. The run blocking just wasn't great last season. And while Graham Mertz was good, he could have been a lot better with more time in the pocket. Like we talked about earlier, the amount of times he was pressured, the amount of times he was sacked in a game last season was just unacceptable. I mean, especially for how good Mertz is, how good of a playmaker he can be. He's going to need more time, and they've addressed that issue. They've added some guys. They're going to get stronger over this offseason. They're coming in with more experience than they did last year. And if they do, it could be the difference in a few games, honestly. And other than blocking, they need to get better on third down. We talked about the third down defense being decent. They're going to need to improve, but the main factor is going to be third down offense. They just could not extend drives, which hurt the defense in the long term. When the defense is on the field most of the time, they're going to get tired, they're going to get injured, and they're not going to be able to stop teams like Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, Texas, and Oklahoma now. It's not going to do them any favors if your offense can't stay on the field. Third down is going to be huge for them. Cannot state that enough. And the last key to success is going to be pass rush. There could be a few other things that you could fit in here, but I feel like pass rush especially needs to improve, especially for an SEC team. The run defense was a problem, but you can't give SEC quarterbacks time to kind of adjust to the defense. We talked about a guy like Carson Beck, Brady Cook, Jalen Milroe. They can hurt you in a number of ways if you give them time. And when you give them zero pressure, like it seemed like Florida did a few times last year, you can't expect to win football games. And while it was partially due to the front seven being pretty young, with an offseason of experience and development, they're desperately going to need to take a big step forward and be able to produce a few guys with at least 5 sacks, maybe 4, 5, 6 sacks. If you can have multiple 4+ sack guys, they had a guy in Princely Unmamielen last year who I believe had 7 sacks. He was a very good defender in that front seven, but he's gone, so they're going to need someone to take his place, and they can. They were a very young unit. They have a lot of potential. There's a lot of talent in that room. They're just going to need to show it on the field this season. And for final grades, the offense is going to come out to an 85. A pretty good unit on the lower end of good, probably more above average to like a decent, solid, good team. The quarterback room is solid. The running back room is solid, although it does have a bit of a depth concern. There's a very talented wide receiver room. It's just the offensive line is scary. They could easily see improvement, but as it stands now, it's hard to put my faith in that. That's going to be weighing them down a lot. That and just overall depth is what's bringing them down to an 85, when they could easily be a high B, 88, 89, even 90 team. They're going to need to show massive improvement on the offensive line before I can really say they're in that higher tier offense. And with that, the defense is going to come into an 83. On the lower end, well, on the higher end of average, but on the lower end overall, they could potentially be a great unit. They could outplay that grade by a lot. There's a lot of potential there, but with the amount of losses they've had to very important players like Unmamielen, we just said, they're going to have a lot of work to do. They do have experience and depth issues overall, and it's very hard to judge. I mean, they could play to a mid-90s even with the amount of talent they have. It's just like the offensive line, like we just said, it's just hard to rank them any higher when there's a lot of uncertainty, and it is pretty scary overall. Could be disastrous, could be good. There's a wide array of possibilities there on that Florida defense. As for special teams, they're a very solid overall unit. Great punter, decent kicker who is probably going to improve this year. Really, all they need is for Smack to improve that long ball, get more accurate from 40+, and they're money. I mean, they're golden. They could be a high 90s unit. I'm not sure if both of them will be back next year. but very solid unit overall. And for coaching, they're going to come in at an 80.5. Now, this is on the lower end, but there's still a lot of hope for Napier and his guys. They just haven't been able to put it on the field. They are pretty good recruiters. They've shown what they can do at teams like Louisiana, but Florida is just a different ball game. You're going to need to win more than 5 games a year if you want to be considered a good staff. And they'll have to make up for the recruiting disaster they just went through this past offseason. I believe they were a top 5 team in recruiting before National Signing Day this past offseason. They lost a lot of guys. They fell drastically. They're still going to have a good class. It's just you can't lose the amount of talent that they lost on National Signing Day. If they make it there, I mean, there is a very good possibility that Napier just is fired before he gets the chance. They have just been dealt a very bad hand. Like I said, I still think he's a pretty good coach. It just has not worked out this far. And for strength of schedule, they are going to get the highest possible grade, a 100.0. Probably the toughest overall schedule, but also very easily the hardest final stretch. That last 5 games is going to be brutal. They are going to be the highest rated strength of schedule this year. And that's going to round them out to an overall of 88.4, a B+. For what it's worth, they should be a pretty decent team, but being a decent team doesn't work in the SEC. There are a lot of decent teams year in and year out, but those teams aren't usually winning 9+ games, especially with a schedule like they have. And for the final predictions, we have Florida grading out to a ceiling of 7-5 with a 3-5 conference record. And this, unfortunately for Florida fans, is very, very generous. This would potentially mean that Florida wins 4 or more games, probably, that they would be underdogs in. Not likely. Unless they get out to a hot start and beat a team like Miami off the rip, they're probably going to be dogs in a lot of the games on their schedule. Which brings us to the floor of 3-9 with a 1-7 conference record. This is going to be them potentially losing all the games that they're dogs in, plus maybe an upset loss as a favorite. This also is pretty unlikely. I mean, most teams don't hit the floor, but I mean, with a schedule like that, you can't really rule anything out. But that takes us to our final prediction, which is another 5-7 finish with a 3-5 conference record. It would be their second season in a row with a 5-7 finish. Their third season in a row with 7 losses to end the season, and would likely spell the end of the Napier era unless Florida, by God's grace, gives Napier another year. I mean, like I said, I don't want to bash Napier. I don't think he's a bad coach. And while it could make sense to keep him for an extra year or two just to see, Florida and Florida's boosters probably aren't going to be happy with that. They're going to want to see success, especially when you're following up a guy like Dan Mullen, who showed them success year in and year out. And overall, a 5-7 finish wouldn't be a terrible season, all things considered. It's just a very unfortunate schedule, like I've said many times in this video. And Florida should improve in several areas in 2024. It's hard to imagine they won't. They could be a much better team than they were last year. It's just, will it be enough to drastically improve their outcome? And that is very hard to pin down. I've said that a lot. Florida is a very hard team to gauge this season. But with all that being said, that is our prediction for Florida in 2024. And if you enjoyed this episode, be sure to like and subscribe. We really appreciate it. If you disagree with anything, I assume there will be a lot of disagreements. Florida is a very controversial team, especially for this upcoming season. Feel free to drop a comment saying what you would change, what you think we're wrong about, what you think we're right about. And like I said at the beginning of this video, be sure to go vote on the next team that you want to see get a season preview for this upcoming season. Stay tuned later this week for the next upload.